this video, we'll go over Part C of the Google Sheet activity Scatterplots. We're going to be looking at how to calculate outliers in scatterplots. Very important for you to realize that the outlier formula for scatterplots is different than the outlier formula you used in Unit 3. You are not using the formula that has the interquartile range in it. So you're not finding the outlier for the x value and the outlier for the second value. It's a very different formula. So statisticians generally agree that the outliers are any points where the residuals are greater than or equal to 2 times the standard deviation of the residuals. That's the upper fence, and the lower fence would be -2 times the standard deviation of the residuals. So we're still going to use the McDonald's sheet. If you take a look at the scatter plot, it may not look like there's any residual or some of these are outliers. If you take a look at the residual plots that you made, you've got some pretty high residuals out here, so there may be some outliers. By looking at the scatter plot and the residual plot, do you think there are any outliers? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Sometimes you think there are outliers and there aren't. So I'm going to go over how to calculate whether there are outliers or not. So please remember, it is a different method than you used in Unit 3. So the first thing is, before you calculate the outliers, you have to do the work from the previous part first. So you have to calculate the fitted values and the residuals. So if you're finding outliers, you can't just jump straight to Part C. You have to make sure you've done Part B first, where you have calculated the fitted values and the residual values. So to determine, let's just move these graphs out of the way. To determine whether there's outliers, you have to calculate the standard deviation of the residuals. So the lower fence is -2 times the standard deviation of the residuals. So the lower fence is equal to -2 times the standard deviation of all the residuals. And the upper fence is +2 times the standard deviation of all the residuals. So that means any residual higher than 122 would be an outlier. You can see that we do have, since the maximum residual is 141, there is going to be an outlier. And the lower fence is -122, so anything lower than 122 would be an outlier. But since our minimum residual is -62, we won't have any negative or lower outliers. Now what we're going to do is filter the residuals to be between the lower fence and the upper fence. So right now, if you were to highlight all of this, and down here, and you look at the count, right now we have 29 numbers. Now when we filter it, what I don't want you to do this time is to highlight all of row H, because we have extra stuff written here, and if you filter the whole column, then you might get rid of these things too. So instead of highlighting all of row H, just highlight cells H1 to H30 and then turn on the filter. Now what you're going to do, 2.3587365, and to make it easier, just copy that without the negative sign and paste it into there for your upper fence and press OK. Again, don't just look and say, oh, it still goes to row 30, so there's no outliers. If you highlight all of the numbers, now it shows there's a count of 27. If this says sum, just click on this and you can look at the count. Before there was 29 numbers, now there's 27 numbers. That means there were 2 outliers. So you will notice that there were 2 outliers. You'll see that row 20 is gone. So whatever piece of data was in row 20 was an outlier. And row 22 is gone, so whatever piece of data was in row 22 was also an outlier. Now when you filter, very important to remember that the graphs will update with the filter, but calculations won't. So for instance here, if you take a look at the original graph over here, you can see that this point and this point are missing. So this point here and this point here were the 2 outliers that disappeared. So the graphs will update. But if you take a look at the correlation coefficient, it still says 0.921, and the slope and the y-intercept have not changed either. So when you filter, the graphs will update, but the calculations won't. Alright, so what we're going to do is copy and paste columns A and B into the McDonald's No Outliers tab. So we're going to take this data that's been filtered, and we're going to copy it and paste it into a new sheet. And now you can calculate the correlation coefficient. So when you calculate the correlation, highlight the y's, highlight the x's, and now you get that the R value is 0.952, and before it was 0.921. So the removal of the outliers did not make a huge difference on the correlation, but removing those 2 outliers just did a bit of change. You can see how the graph changed. You can see how the residual plot changed. So the 2 things that I want to, well, I guess 3 things I seriously want to point out is that the outlier method in 2 variable statistics, which is in scatter plots, is different than it is in the unit 3. So it's not the same formula. Second thing is when you remove the outliers, you have to make sure that you have done part B first, where you've calculated the residuals, because you need to calculate the residuals before you use the formula, because the formula is used on the residuals. And the third thing is when you remove the outliers, you have to remember that the graphs will change automatically, but the calculations will not. So if you're going to make further calculations on the filtered data, the data without the outliers, you have to copy it and paste it into a new sheet before you do any calculations.